Good evening. My name is Grace Valenzuela. I'm the Communications and Community Partnership Director for Portland Public Schools. Welcome to Parent University. Parent U is a forum to bring together parents and caregivers to learn from subject experts and each other. Through classes and events that are fun, interactive, and informative, we offer topics important to families. I'd like to start by saying thank you to our staff, Lynette Dyer-Blake and Maureen Clancy, for organizing and attending to the details of this event. I also want to extend my special thanks to our interpreters, Josephine Bisimana, Betsy Pastumesi, Karina Foley, and Madi Abdullah. A reminder to our presenters to pause, slow down their speech so our interpreters can catch up with you. Tonight's session on reckoning with New England's past and its role in the history of slavery in this country is the second of a two-part presentation discussion on the exploration of slavery in the North and New England's complicity in the global economy of enslavement. We have much learned from scholars on the subject, as our history books and regional narratives left out this critical aspect of our past, along with the stories of local Black and Indigenous populations. These omissions impact our understanding of the past and create challenges in connecting our past to our present and our future as a community and as a nation. Last week's presentation was powerful and enlightening. Tonight's session promises to be another eye-opening one. We have 5 scholars tonight on our panel. I will introduce one of them, Meadow Dibble, and Meadow will introduce the rest of her co-presenters. We know Meadow as a parent in Portland Public Schools. She's the founding director of Black Box and is currently a visiting scholar at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. She received her PhD from Brown University, and I will turn it over to Meadow.
Thank you so much, Grace. And thanks to Nanette as well, who did so much to organize this event. Thank you, interpreters. All of you have done a tremendous job helping us reach a wider audience. We will make a great effort to speak slowly this evening. I'm just gonna share my screen here. I'd also like to thank those of you who are joining us tonight. Some of you may have attended the first event last week. If you did not, we will be sharing a link to that recording, which you can also find at the homepage of Portland Public Schools Parent University. My colleagues and I are very glad for the opportunity to be with you here this evening to continue sharing some of what we know about Maine's historical involvement in the Atlantic world slave economy, but also to talk about what we have yet to learn and how we came to suffer from collective amnesia, and why historical recovery work is a critical site of anti-racist organizing, important to us as members of the community, but also to our students. What you are looking at here is a 19th century black box. This is a document chest that would have accompanied a sea captain on his journeys overseas. This is thought to have belonged, in fact, to the most prominent sea captain from my hometown of Brewster on Cape Cod, a man by the name of Elijah Cobb. Elijah Cobb is greatly revered. He spent 40 years on the Atlantic, sailing to Europe to the West Indies, even to Africa. But what I want to bring your attention to is the nature of this box. What do you notice about it? It's empty. Now, this serves as a very, I think, apt metaphor for the state of our archive here in New England. Presumably, this box would have contained logbooks, customs records, ship manifests, correspondence with merchants. None of that critical documentation remains for this particular sea captain, as is true for many of Maine's sea captains, those of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. The box, if you will, or the historical record is full of gaping holes, which makes doing this research and coming to a full understanding of New England's investment in the slave trade and the economy of enslavement very difficult. Many of these documents have simply disappeared, and you won't find smoking guns just lying around. But why is the box empty? We need to ask. Well, scholars often lament that countless customs records went up in flames in Boston's devastating fire of 1872, for example, or Portland's fire of 1866. But not all losses can be attributed to mere accident. Deliberate sabotage was absolutely a factor in making out, in emptying the box. All it takes, however, is a bit of curiosity, and you will discover that there is evidence of New England's complicity in the Atlantic world slave economy all around us. It is inscribed in stone in our cemeteries. You'll find it in our vital records, in the probate records, in newspapers, and also in our built environment, which is a subject that Seth Goldstein will be talking about in particular this evening. What I mean to say is that this evidence has been hiding in plain sight, and we have been blind to it, more or less. We haven't been looking for it. We haven't been curious to know, to truly and deeply know the places that we call home. And it is also fair to say that we have lacked the critical tools to interpret our findings. And thank goodness for scholars like Kate Mcmahon here with us again this evening, who are part of an emerging field of scholarship devoted to unearthing this history and helping us to understand our role in the Atlantic world in past centuries. So the evidence is there, but there is too much of it, actually, for a handful of historians to process, which is one of the reasons why we at Atlantic Black Box want to involve students in the work of historical recovery. Despite these gaping holes in the historical record, by collaborating to perform concerted research at the local level, we can recover our collective memory. And thanks to these sustained efforts, we can hope to recover our humanity. Atlantic Black Box, through its community-based historical recovery model is all about empowering individuals and institutions throughout the region to perform a deep audit of local and state archives and helping folks to read and interpret their findings through the lens of racial history, which we feel is a critical step in advancing equity efforts in the present and in crafting a just future. What if New England's vessels had carried black boxes the way the aircraft do today? We feel that we would be in a much better position to understand the injustices that we are witnessing, the inequities, and the disparities that so riddle our society today. So we're looking to build a better box and to retroactively fill it with findings sourced at the micro local level, thanks to grassroots community organizing. We want this to be in full view, transparent, open access, available to all, because a big part of the reason we don't know this history better is precisely due to the fragmented nature of the archive. Again, today we have the tools to, we have these wonderful dynamic online platforms where we can safely store information, offer it up to the public, and ensure that it never disappears from our collective consciousness again. So just as a reminder, in session 1, these are the topics that we covered. And if you'd like to learn more, you can go back to the recording. I've also placed in a shared folder, a resources folder, the slideshow, the entire slide deck from our first session that will be available to all. We will include that link in the chat. Today, we will be diving into Portland's role in the Atlantic world slave economy, looking also at Maine's historical African-American communities, focusing on resistance, abolition, resilience, and agency, and talking about how we teach this hard history, approaches to bringing it to even the youngest students. Here with us again this evening is Kate Mcmahon, who is a museum specialist at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Kate leads research efforts at the Center for the Study of Global Slavery, and a number of links to her research will be offered in the chat as well throughout the talk. Dustin Ward is a pastor and founding director of It Is Time, an organization devoted to ending racism in Maine and New England. Linda Ash Ford is an educator and a storyteller with over 40 years of classroom experience, as well as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice facilitator. And Seth Goldstein is our maritime historian who has taught at University of New England, Southern Maine Community College, and now Mecca, the Maine College of Art. Seth also provides guided historic walking tours of Portland through his company, Main Street Tours. And now I'm going to turn it over to Seth.
Thanks so much, Meadow. I'd like to start my presentation with a land acknowledgement. We find ourselves today on the lands of the Wabanaki First Peoples. I would like to offer my respect to the Wabanaki tribes that inhabit Maine today, as well as their elders, both past and present. And just a word about myself, I'm a historian, I'm an educator, but I'm also a parent, like many of you. I have an 8-year-old daughter and I have a 6-year-old daughter, and they're in school in the public school system where I live here in South Portland. So I, like many of you, am very invested in this topic. Today I'll be discussing Portland, Maine, and the Atlantic world slave economy. Next slide, please. So just a reminder, we went over these terms last week, but for those of you who weren't with us, or for those of you who were with us, a reminder, I prefer to use, and we at Atlantic Black Box use the term enslaved Africans as opposed to slaves. This reminds us that this state of slavery was something that was forced onto these individuals, hence the term enslaved. Self-emancipating person as opposed to runaway slave. This term really exhibits the agency that an individual had to have to undertake this activity of emancipating themselves from slavery. Too often we think of self-emancipating persons as being passive, like the terminology for the Underground Railroad, which would refer to them as packages. But really, these people had to be incredibly brave to undertake this self-freeing activity. As many of us know, they risked harsh punishment if they were captured. And then finally, the term Atlantic world slave economy, as opposed to triangle trade or Atlantic world economy. This reminds us that it was really the labor of enslaved Africans that is the engine that's driving the entire Atlantic world economy at this time. And then I will use the term African diaspora frequently. African diaspora includes African Americans who can trace their migration to the Middle Passage across the Atlantic, as well as more recent waves of African migrants, for example, Cape Verde immigrants who came from the islands off the west coast of Africa, and other later migrating individuals from the African continent. Next slide, please. So here are some key dates regarding African slavery in the United States. The first enslaved Africans were brought to British North America in 1619. Now, I'll remind you, that is 1 year before the Pilgrims arrive. Massachusetts and Maine end slavery in 1783. And we'll all remember that Maine is part of Massachusetts until 1820. The United States banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808. Before that, the importation of enslaved Africans is legal. Following that, there's an illicit slave trade that Kate did such a good job of detailing for us last week. There's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution of the United States. It's Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, and that's from 1787, and that details that self-emancipating enslaved Africans are to be returned to their owners in the American South. Furthermore, there are fugitive slave acts in 1793 and again in 1850, which further tighten up these laws about self-emancipating enslaved Africans having to be returned to their owners in the American South. Finally, there's the Emancipation Proclamation, and that takes place in 1863. Next slide, please. So, African and Indigenous American slavery. This is a topic that not many people are aware of. So colonies, the entire point of colonies is to make money. Sometimes it's to make money for a country, sometimes it's to make money for a company that has shareholders. But the entire point is profits. And so to make money, you need labor. So Christopher Columbus first enslaves Indigenous Americans on his second voyage to the quote unquote New World, and that's in 1496. The English would look to the examples of the Spanish and Portuguese when they start developing their colonies. And so they would enslave Indigenous Americans using an existing system of captive taking that was already present among First Peoples. In warfare amongst First Peoples, the ultimate objective was to take captives. These captives could then be brought back to the home village of the victors, where the entire community could enact their vengeance. Now, sometimes these captives would be killed. Sometimes they would be made slaves and have to endure harsh servitude. But sometimes these individuals would be adopted into the family, sometimes to replace members of the family that had been lost through warfare. So the English here in New England are able to manipulate this system, as I said, to capture First Peoples. And what they realize is that they can exchange these First Peoples for enslaved Africans in the West Indies. The first time this happens is during the Pequot War, which is 1636 to 1638. And this takes place in Connecticut. And so a group of Indigenous Americans are captured in this war and taken down to an English colony in the West Indies and exchanged for enslaved Africans who are then brought to New England. A couple of reasons for this. One reason, whereas Indigenous Americans had some limited legal rights here in New England, enslaved Africans had no legal rights. The second reason is that whereas Indigenous Americans had family and friends in the woods or the periphery of the communities that they could run away to, this was not an option for enslaved Africans. And so we see a transformation in early colonial New England from the enslaving of Indigenous Americans to the use of enslaved Africans. So what that looks like here in Portland is the enslaved Africans in this area worked as domestics or servants in rich individuals' homes. Because the climate here doesn't allow for the plantation agriculture that you see in the American South, there's not that same type of agricultural slavery in this part of New England, although in Rhode Island, there is some plantation enslaved labor. But here, enslaved Africans are really status symbols. So rich merchants would have enslaved Africans to work in their homes and to show off their wealth. An example of this is Colonel Ezekiel Cushing, who was one of the first merchants involved in the West Indies trade. He was based out of Symington Cove, but we know Symington Cove today better as Willard Beach. He was known as a well-to-do merchant, and he built the first two-story brick house on the point that still bears his name today, Cushing Point. We know Cushing Point better today as Bug Light Park. Now, a quote from a 20th century maritime historian states, and I quote, "As was the case with many men of colonial means, Cushing owned Negro slaves. When Cushing died in 1765, he left two slaves, Cato and Phyllis, to his son Thomas, and a 4-year-old Negro girl, Dinah, to his wife Mary." So a lot of people have a misconception that slavery was an institution that took place in the American South. But this is not the case. There was slavery in New England and the North as well. Next slide, please. So here we see the Atlantic world slave economy. And so this is what would have been previously called the triangle trade. More accurately today, we're calling it the Atlantic world slave economy to acknowledge that the labor of enslaved Africans is the primary engine that's driving this whole economy between the 4 continents that border the Atlantic Ocean. So if we look here at Maine, we can see coming from Maine down to the West Indies, red oak staves, lumber, and fish. Now, this is in 1650, so the colonial period, and so these items are going to Barbados. Later on, our primary trade partner will become the island of Haiti. When Haiti gains its independence in the late 1700s, our primary trading partner will become Cuba. What's coming up from the West Indies to New England? We can see here the arrow that goes from Barbados to New England. It's molasses, sugar, and rum. So New England provides the West Indies with its staves. A stave is part of a barrel that's broken down into its basic components, and lumber and fish. And I'll tell you more about those commodities in just a minute. Next slide, please. So here's sugar production in the West Indies. Sugar plantations are considered some of the first industrial production centers, since they combine both aspects of agriculture and factory work. The work was so incredibly difficult and dangerous that on average, enslaved Africans survived for only 7 years once they reached Cuba. They were literally worked to death. And this was horrific working conditions. And there are details that I could share with you that are truly troubling. But I'll spare you that tonight. Go to the next slide, please. Cuban molasses was used to make rum, which was a major commodity in Maine. The large amount of raw sugar being exported to Portland leads to the city's first sugar house being opened in 1845. But even before that, there are large quantities of molasses being shipped to Portland. In the late 1700s, there are 7 rum distilleries on the Portland waterfront. And so much molasses is coming up here that it can fuel 7 rum distilleries. Some of this rum is being shipped to the west coast of Africa on the vessels that Kate told us about last week. Vessels built here in Maine, captained by Mainers, and crewed by Mainers. That rum, distilled in Portland, shipped across the Atlantic, is used to buy enslaved Africans on the west coast of Africa. Next slide, please. So here we see the largest building on the Portland waterfront in the 1800s. It was the John Bundy Brown Sugar Refinery. It is 8 stories tall. It dwarfs all of the buildings around it. Now, Portland imported 3 times more molasses than Boston. And the Portland Sugar House was processing 200 hogshead. A hogshead is a size of barrel that happens to be 63 gallons. So 200 hogsheads of molasses per day. By 1855, the business employed between 150 and 200 workers, and 10 years later, it employed almost 1,000 individuals. About this time, 1860, 20% of all of the molasses in the US was processed right here in Portland. And this is more than any other city in the United States. Can I have the next slide, please? So John Bundy Brown was the owner of this sugar refinery, and he makes a lot of money in the sugar business. He makes so much money that he buys most of the land that will become the Western Prom in Portland. There he builds his palatial mansion, which he calls Bromhill. The neighborhood is still known as Bromhill today. Now his mansion burns down, so it's no longer on the Western Prom. But he sells parcels of land to many of his rich merchant friends, and they build their mansions on the Western Prom. So many of the beautiful Victorian mansions that dot the Western Promenade of Portland and throughout the city are made through this trade in sugar. And so it's a major component of Portland's architecture today. Brown also becomes a major patron of the arts, and it is his art collection that is the beginning of the Portland Art Museum. Show the next slide, please. So here we see some really interesting things. We see on the left sugar nips. And what they would have done with those sugar nips is they would have chopped off a little piece of this sugar cone that you see to the right of it. And they would have put that in their tea. And so at first, sugar is a very much a luxury commodity, and only rich people can afford it. With increased labor of enslaved Africans, sugar becomes a more popular commodity, and there's different qualities of sugar. Sometimes it's molasses, brown sugar, or this very refined white sugar. So well-to-do Portlanders would have kept their refined white sugar sometimes in a bowl, like you see in the upper right there is a sugar bowl in the collection of the Maine Historical Society. And because this was such a luxury commodity, they would have wanted to have shown it off. And so it would have been on their dining room table, these ornate bowls filled with sugar so they could exhibit their wealth. Could I have the next slide, please? So here's a wonderful quote from an essay called Comunidad Escondidita, Latin American Influence in 19th and 20th Century Portland. And this is by David Carey Jr., and it was published in a wonderful book titled Creating Portland. I quote, "For much of the 19th century, Portland was a major entrepot of international commerce. At a time when Cuba was the United States' 3rd largest trading partner, Portland was one of the major ports in this exchange, and Maine ships were among the most common vessels trafficking in the West Indies. Ships loaded with lumber, bricks, and ice set sail for the Caribbean islands and returned with sugar, molasses, rum, and goods to stock local grocery stores. The wealth generated in this trade affected Portland's physical environment, from landfill extended wharves to large homes that remain central to Portland's identity. The Portland bricks that dot the streets of Trinidad, Cuba, are symbolic of the intricate relations between Portland and Latin America. And so the waterfront of Portland at this time is filled in the 1850s to accommodate this growing West Indies trade. So before 1850, Commercial Street was part of the harbor. Fore Street was right along the river, and it's called Fore Street because it was right along what was called the Fore River at that time. So if you're standing on Commercial Street in 1850, you would have been underwater. Once again, it was filled in to accommodate these wharfs that were getting longer and longer out into the harbor to accommodate the increasing number of ships involved in this West Indies trade. The land was also filled in to accommodate railroad tracks, and these railroad tracks connected the Grand Trunk Railroad, which was on the east side of the peninsula, with the Boston Railroad that was on the west side of the peninsula. And to facilitate all of this trade, they built these 4 or 5 parallel railroad tracks where Commercial Street now stands. Now, in this picture here, we see the streets of Trinidad, Cuba. This photo was taken by Linda when she was in Trinidad a couple years ago. As you can see, still today, the streets of Trinidad, Cuba are lined with the ballast stones of the main ships that traded there. Next slide, please. Once again, this is something that Linda shared with me a couple of days ago. This is a letter that's in the possession of the Maine Historical Society, and it was written by a young woman who's visiting Trinidad, Cuba, and she's writing home to her friend in Portland. Letter to Elizabeth Munford in Portland from a friend in Trinidad, Cuba, July 4th, 1847. To Elizabeth, I should like to spend some time in the country were it not for the shrieks of the slaves, which you hear constantly, someone or another being nearly all the time at the whipping post. And so Linda was explaining to me that the plantation owners lived in the cities. They had 2 homes. They had a home at the plantation, but they had a much more opulent home where their families resided in the city, because in the countryside, the plantations was where all of this work was going on. But in the cities, they could enjoy their wealth and feel comfortable and enjoy their families, only going to the plantations to make sure that the work was going according to schedule. Could I have the next slide, please? So now I'm going to talk about some of the important commodities that Maine sent to the West Indies in return for this sugar, molasses, and rum. Here we see a codfish. Cod, one of the most important fish species in human history. So important, in fact, that a gentleman wrote a book called Cod, the Fish That Changed the World, and that is by Mark Kurlansky. You can see the credit at the bottom there. Now, why is cod so popular? Why is cod so important? Its flaky white meat lends itself to being preserved by salting. which is critically important before refrigeration. Now we have to remember that before refrigeration, all of your food would have had to have been preserved, whether it was smoked or salted or pickled, it had to be preserved. And the properties of the cod fish just happen to take the salting process better than any other type of protein. And so hence, this is the cheapest protein available, and large quantities are shipped from New England to feed the enslaved Africans who work on the sugar plantations. Cod can grow to very impressive size. A codfish weighing over 200 pounds, 6 feet tall, caught off the coast of Massachusetts in 1895. That's a huge fish. The fish is so important to the post-revolutionary New England economy that a wooden cod hung from the ceiling of the old State House in Boston. And that wooden cod still hangs from the ceiling in the State House in Boston today. Next slide, please. This is a wonderful picture. This is the Portland Fishing Fleet, 1882, as you can see from the caption in the top right-hand corner there. So whereas Portland is not the major fishing center of Maine, it is Maine's fish export center. That is to say, the cod may be caught elsewhere in the Gulf of Maine, but then it's shipped here to Portland to be processed and then transshipped to its eventual destination, very often in the West Indies. So I believe that this location here is behind Harbor Fish Market, where the fishing boats still come in today. Could I have the next slide, please? So this is what would be called a flake yard. Each one of these items that you see on these tables, each one of those white items is an individual fillet of cod that's been salted and left out in the sun to cure and to be turned into salt cod. Look at the size of that flake yard. It gives you an indication of how big this industry was. And so this is on the Portland waterfront, a flake yard from 1882. Could I have the next slide, please? Another major component of what Portland and Maine ships to the West Indies is lumber. Now, due to the fact that much of Cuba's forests have been cut down to make room for sugar plantations, Maine supplied the lumber for building in Cuba. So the profits from the sugar are so immense that most of the forests are cut down and they're not growing their own food crops in Cuba. Maine provides the lumber and Maine provides the food for these plantations. For example, the port of Matanzas was built almost entirely of New England lumber. Maine also supplied many of the boxes and casks in which the sugar and molasses were shipped. Could I have the next slide, please? So in his chapter titled The West India Trade, in a book called The Maritime History of Maine, historian William Rowe does not mention enslaved African labor once. The entire chapter is about this West Indies trade, yet somehow he manages to not mention that the commodity that is driving this commerce is produced by enslaved African labor. And this maritime history book was written in the 1950s. It's a great example of the way in which we here in New England revere this maritime history and heritage, but often don't consider what it's related to. But I have a quote here from William Rowe that really gives you an example of how Maine is tied into this commerce with the West Indies. And he says, I quote, "Many small sawmills were busy sawing and fitting the box boards to proper length, all ready to be set up and nailed on the sugar plantation. The cooper's trade in the manufacture of hogshead and tierce, it should say shooks and tier shooks, was one of the best paid in the towns near the coast." And so let me explain. Shooks are broken down barrels that would have been broken down to save space. So it would have been the barrel staves, heads, and hoops broken down and then shipped to the West Indies. This was a very popular trade, the trade of cooper. Cooper is somebody who makes casks. You can see here the variety of sizes of casks. One of them is the hogshead, as mentioned in the writing, and also the tierce, which is also mentioned in the writing. But these are all various size of casks. We know them more today by the word barrels. But everything that was shipped in the 1800s, by and large, is shipped in barrels. This is true for liquids. This is true for solids, salt cod, rum, mackerel. So in 1867, there are 263 such shops in the state. So it says the shook was a package of red oak staves, numbered and ready to be set up as hogshead, a tierce, or a cask. This was done by coopers on the plantations or by state of Maine coopers who went out to the islands for that purpose. So coopers from Maine went down to the West Indies to assemble these casks so they could be packed with sugar and molasses and then shipped here to Maine. Next slide, please. The farms and lumber camps of northern New England, including Vermont and New Hampshire, produced food and lumber for the sugar plantations. In turn, lumberjacks and farmers consumed large quantities of molasses and rum. These goods are shipped back and forth between the hinterland and Portland using a system of canals that are built in the 1800s. The most famous of these canal systems is the Cumberland-Oxford Canal, which is completed in 1830. And the bank that funds this canal, the building is still in Portland today, across from the Nickelodeon movie theater, is the Cumberland Oxford Bank building. And that bank was capitalized to fund the building of this canal. And so I've read accounts of farmers coming through the Crawford Notch, which is a place in the White Mountains where you could come through on a wagon or a sled. They would have all of their farm produce on their wagons. They would be driving their pigs and cattle before them, all to be sold on the waterfront in Portland. And this was in exchange for all of their finished goods and their sugar and their rum that they would take back with them to their farms for that year. Could I have the next slide, please? Here's another quote that I'll share with you from Rowe's The Maritime History of Maine. Quote, "Then also there were house frames all ready to put up, oxen and horses for the plow, the sugar and the treadmill, farm produce such as parsnips, potatoes, onions, and grain, beef, mutton, pork, pickled fish, soap, candles, and codfish in drums of from 5 to 800 pounds each. Lumber from the banks of Maine rivers, which cost $8 a thousand, sold in Havana for $60. Beets and parsnips brought $16 a barrel in the French islands. Next slide, please. So just really briefly, I'm going to talk about Portland and the Underground Railroad. Next slide, please. So here you can see the Underground Railroad throughout the United States. You have the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 required lawmen to capture any self-emancipating person and return them to their owners in the American South. Can I have the next slide, please? So you had free African-American sailors who would assist with the Underground Railroad. And so they might help a self-emancipating individual in the American South stow away aboard a ship. And then when that ship reaches New England, this free African sailor could connect that self-emancipating individual with the Underground Railroad network. And that happened here in Portland. Next slide, please. Here we see a coin that was discovered by my friend with a metal detector on the shore of Merrymeeting Bay. And it's an 1845 silver dollar. And you can see the holes at the top of it that have been pressed into the coin. Now those make out the shape of the Big Dipper, or as self-emancipating individuals would have called it, the drinking gourd. And this is because they would have followed the drinking gourd north to freedom in Canada. Next slide, please. And so here we see a marker for the Portland Freedom Trail. This was designed by local artist Daniel Minter. And the Freedom Trail was established in 2007. It's a series of 16 granite pillars throughout the city that are at the locations that were significant to individuals in the African diaspora. Next slide, please. This is one of the sites. This is Lloyd Scott's secondhand clothing store on Exchange Street. He was an individual who was involved with the Portland Union Anti-Slavery Society, but also in his capacity as a secondhand clothing purveyor, he would have been able to help self-emancipating Africans by providing them with a disguise. That's one of the reasons why he's in secondhand clothing. Because if you could change your appearance and not be captured, then perhaps you could reach Canada and freedom and not be sent back to servitude in the American South. This is also the reason why a lot of African-American individuals or people from the African diaspora wind up as barbers. They would have wigs and false beards for self-emancipating Africans. So once again, they could disguise themselves to hopefully get to Canada and freedom. Next slide, please. Now, this is the plaque from Reuben Ruby's hack stand. Reuben Ruby is certainly one of the forefathers of the African American community and African diaspora community here in Portland. In fact, he donates the land where the Abyssinian church is built and contributes money to the building of the Abyssinian church. But he's a hack driver, which means he drives around a carriage. It's basically a horse-drawn taxi. In his capacity of hack driver, he would have been able to spirit people around the city of Portland from safe house to safe house, and eventually out of the city to freedom. Next slide, please. This is the plaque at General Samuel Fessenden's house. He heard William Lloyd Garrison speak when he came to Portland in 1832. This was really the beginning of the abolition movement here in Portland. Garrison advocated for the immediate emancipation of enslaved Africans at a time when many white abolitionists wanted free Africans to be sent to West Africa. And so he comes to town in 1832, William Lloyd Garrison, and converts a lot of white abolitionists to this idea of immediate emancipation without compensation. Next slide, please. This is the plaque that is at modern day Lincoln Park. It's where the Quaker Meeting House used to be. You can see here from the plaque, in 1836, Portland's first pro-slavery riot occurred. A pro-slavery riot. There was another one in 1847, when abolitionists Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Charles Lennox attempted to lecture. There were riots, and these speakers had to be rescued by anti-slavery women abolitionists here in Portland. Why anti-abolition riots? Because the Portland merchants are so invested in trade with the West Indies and the American South, they don't want abolition. They don't want to do away with this institution of slavery. Next slide, please. Here we see the Abyssinian Meeting House. It was built in 1828. This is the United States' third oldest African meeting house, following meeting houses that were built in Boston and Nantucket. It was built by individuals from the African diaspora here in Portland who were tired of sitting in the backs of the white churches. They wanted their own church. It was involved in the Underground Railroad. There was also a school for children from the African diaspora at the Abyssinian Church. It's active till about 1917. Still part of the architecture of Portland today, very little known. Next slide, please. As we can see here from this headline from the Portland Press Herald, it is actively being restored today, and they've recently received a large amount of money to continue that restoration. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Just to briefly say that we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, but if anything inspires you to ask a question, please feel free to put it in the Q&A section right next to the chat button at the bottom of your screen.
Hello, I'm going to be talking about teaching the hard history, the hidden history of the North's involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. I want to start by saying that all students deserve a truthful, age-appropriate account of our past that is inclusive of all the groups that were a part of our shared history. When taught in an age-appropriate way that engages students in the learning process, students become invested in their learning and in questioning all of the things that they have heard about the history of our country. Teaching this history is not about teaching absolutes. There are no absolute heroes and there are no absolute villains. Instead, it's about teaching about real people and the social choices that they make and how those choices affect their lives. By that, I mean that instead of teaching dates and events, you talk about the dates and events and how they connect to real people and what those dates and events, how they impact those people's lives then and now. Now, there are a couple of key methods to teaching this history, and it can be done for students kindergarten through high school. And there are a couple of methods I'm going to talk about. The first one is an inquiry design model. In this design model, to engage students well, we'll start with the place-based inquiry model. Students study the system of American chattel slavery through the lens of history that's based in a specific place. This is place-based inquiry. So you're thinking about what happened in the state, region, or town that you live in as it relates to slavery, as it relates to the practice of slavery, and and you ask students to use the method of researching real people, laws, and the society of the area that you're in, and you develop answers to inquiry questions on the topic of slavery. So you're asking students and teachers to reference original source materials related to the lives of the people to paint a picture of how their own area was involved in the slave trade. You're also learning to research, evaluate, and communicate an understanding of how slavery was influenced by the historical people and actions that take place in your area. And finally, you're asking students to draw on their understanding of this shared past to explain how it affects our present. So in this method, you're letting students engage in an inquiry that is right where they are. So it becomes really intensely personal in their understanding of how the Atlantic slave trade affected not only someone distant from them, but where they live today. Let's do the next slide. The other method we talk about is akin to this. This is an inquiry design model. The inquiry design model engages students in seeking answers to essential questions on the topic of slavery. This curriculum approach asks students to become a key component in their own learning. So we're asking students and teachers to access what they think they know, to assess that, to develop questions and methods to seek out more information from various sources, which would include original source documents, text, historical archives, and other information. Then we're asking them to learn to evaluate the sources and form ideas about slavery based on the evidence that they find. Having formed an answer to their essential question, they look at how the past actions might influence our current situations. And finally, we ask the students to communicate an understanding of what they've learned on this topic. So these two models fit.
Linda, you got muted somehow.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. There is a curriculum resource for one of these models, which is Learning for Justice, and they offer a framework for teaching the hard history of slavery in an age-appropriate manner. This framework can be downloaded for free from their website, and it comes in two sections. The first section is a framework for students kindergarten through 5th grade. And the second section involves a framework of teaching this hard history 6th grade through high school. As an example of how this model works, each student in the kindergarten to 2nd grade section would learn about slavery via essential knowledge questions. So they would have a key question, for example, what is freedom for kindergartners and 1st graders and 2nd graders? And they would look at that essential question, what is freedom, put that into the context of the history of our country, which leads to a conversation about what is slavery, at which point they would learn that slavery involves enforced labor of people who have no choice in whether or not they want to do the work. It would begin to talk about the Atlantic slave trade in a real sense. It is a very simple concept for young children that age to grasp because they are developmentally very interested in issues of in issues of fairness, and those are concepts that they can easily grasp. As children grow in age, the essential questions become more complicated. There are a list of 10 essential questions that you hope students will learn in grades kindergarten through 5th grade, so they become used to and have a deeper understanding of what truly was the Atlantic slave trade, who was involved, who participated.
Linda, we lost your sound again.
Who benefit from it and who didn't benefit from it. So that's a really great start for younger children in a very age-appropriate way. As you move into the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, the questions and the framework becomes more complicated, and you begin to look at this issue in terms of era, in terms of who's involved. Again, you're asking essential questions that you're asking your students to assess, think about, and research. One of the advantages to using some of the materials in Learning for Justice is that these materials involve student texts. They involve the inquiry model of students asking questions and being involved in looking for research on those issues. It also involves resources around appropriate books on the issue of slavery that involve children's literature. There's a podcast. So there's a wealth of resources that a teacher can use to do this work. I would also suggest that if you don't follow this particular curriculum word for word, what you can do is use this as a resource to further deepen the curriculum that you're already using. In this way, you are beginning to help your students question how regular people were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and you're humanizing across that curriculum that real people made real decisions and were affected by those decisions even into today. So it's the beginning of really uncovering a hidden history that we don't really know very much about. Okay.
Well, Seth, Linda, I want to thank you so much. And as we kind of culminate our night together, I want to sort of finalize this idea and answer the question, why? Why do we need to learn this history? And I want to bring just my personal story into the picture. And maybe that'll help better understand why this history is so critical. It's really surrounding the questions of identity. See, I grew up in Presque Isle. That's about 6 hours north of here. I was 10 years from the Canadian border. My gram could see the Canadian border from her house. And as a BIPOC member, a Black man, I needed this historical education because it was hard to recognize who I was. I was isolated in Presque Isle, especially since it was a mostly white community. And thus the questions of my identity began to form. You see, because of comments I heard as a kid, I didn't know my roots or my origins. I couldn't answer, who am I? I searched for that answer to that narrative. Because as you've heard, this story was not being told. I couldn't explain how I fit into a society that didn't look like me. My first association with my identity was 5th grade. I was a young student, and I asked my 5th grade history teacher, as we were learning about civil rights, I said, which water fountain would I drink from? She said, you drink from the black one. And it's because of the 1-drop rule. A drop of blood of any African descent made you a Negro at that time or a Black individual. But similarly, at the same time, in 5th grade, I heard my first racial slur. A student who was mad at me, called me Blackie. And I realized right then, my color made me different. It could be used as an attack against me. Not only did it affirm my identity as a Black man, but also that I was other. I was not the same as my friends. And so I began to hear racism and stereotyping as a kid. I witnessed it in middle school and high school, being made fun of, jokes, comments, all based on my skin color. Now you couple that with the misunderstanding of what it meant to be Black by the misassociation of who Black people were by the individuals around me, all because this wasn't fully developed as we were young kids living in Presque Isle. Thus, I became susceptible to racial bigotry and stereotyping. I became a novelty to white individuals. And what this did is it culminated and amounted to never feeling like I belonged. I tell folks most times I was too dark for white people, and at times I was too light for Black people. I never felt I was equal. Those around me seemed better. They knew who they were. And so I was left with emotions I really couldn't process. I actually felt so alone. And that's why it's so important that we all know this history. You see, within a white world, there's a danger, and we talked about this last session, of the singular lens, of the assumption of the natural order of things, that everything should be understood with a white context. This history, a lot of which you've heard tonight, could have helped those around me that didn't necessarily look like me to appreciate who I was and to not stereotype me based on things they did not know. They could see me as a valued part of American history, as bad as sometimes that history is as we learn it. Even as a student at USM, I loved my education at USM. I loved my time over there, but I still felt alone. I still was disconnected because I realized something. I was living within this reality of what sometimes gets known as white America, but really it's an America that is processing its levels of racism. This didn't change because I grew up or I went to college, but by unearthing Maine's history and understanding the association that Black and brown individuals have, and understanding that by being in a white society, I could be recognized and included in this world, especially Maine, if this history was just taught. And what it would do is help show that people cared about our BIPOC brothers and sisters. That would give us a space to fit in. It would show a level of care for that other. Others could then affirm and support who I was as a BIPOC member. And that allows us to go from just learning to empathizing, to personalizing, and thus to help solidify a part of having a perfect purpose, even in the state of Maine. And the beauty of what you've heard tonight is this history can help us define where we all live. History is both oral, but it's geographical as well. Learning this local history, which I've enjoyed hearing a lot of tonight, has created a sense of connection to the place we all call home. And it can lessen that feeling of being some novelty to this area, especially to the state of Maine. If I'd have had this history, I wouldn't have felt like an outcast. I wouldn't have felt out of place. I could see my state, the towns I drove and went through, the cities I knew, and the places that I intertwined with. I could see them intertwined with my own history, with my own identity. I could finally find roots within this history that runs deep in a mostly white state. It would have deepened my association, not just with Presque Isle, but with the state of Maine in its entirety. But having this history, and why this is so important, is I believe this would have finalized my belonging. I would have belonged, and belonging has eluded so many of us for so long. I didn't really have a full family history anyways. You see, I was adopted at 2 months old, and I've been learning pieces of my ancestry along the way. My birth mom has filled in a lot of the gaps, especially in my adult life, and has also affirmed what I already knew in 5th grade. I'm a BIPOC member, a Black man. But despite leaving one place and going all the way up to Presque Isle, it doesn't mean I lose my identity in this new area. No, those roots in history run deep, and they run deep in Maine, and we've heard that tonight. And so if I'd have learned this at this critical age, at such a young age, as what Linda was talking about, in the way Linda was describing, there would have been a sense of belonging that could have been established long ago, along with many other factors. But this would have been a critical piece, to know that I wasn't on some island. I wasn't alone out here in sort of a white community. I too had a place in history, and it would have gone such a long ways. And so, folks, this is why we do this work. This is why we need to teach and explain and unearth the truth of this history, some of which you heard Seth say doesn't always get taught. This is why our work must continue, and it does continue. BIPOC members have felt disconnected, especially in this land we do call home. But we don't need to feel that way any longer. We can learn that Black history is American history. That's why BIPOC members need to know it. This is our city. These are our roots. These are our origins. And it instills a sense of pride that sometimes has been knocked down for too long. And so it is exciting to know that we belong. And it's such a powerful feeling. And so with that, and that little bit of piece of personal history, I hope we can understand why it is so critical and valued to keep on teaching these great pieces of history. Thank you.
Wow, Dustin, thank you so much. That was fabulous. Thank you, Seth. Thanks, Linda. And special thank you to two important people who I neglected to introduce at the outset. That is Kit Meyer, our wonderful inaugural Atlantic Black Box intern, and Vivian Cunningham, who is a student at Mecca and now our second intern. Kit just graduated from Skidmore straight into the pandemic, and we have benefited tremendously from her help with all kinds of things. We would like to open it up to Q&A. As you know, we would have loved for this to be more interactive. We're a bit limited by circumstances, but please, we've seen a couple questions in the Q&A. Anyone see questions they'd like to take? Looks like
I can do one. There's a question about how white teachers can teach this history and how we can prepare to teach this history if we're not people of color. My first recommendation is to become familiar with the history, to realize that the history is more than dates and events. That's the first step. The next step is to begin to research the area where you live, because place-based history and kids are a wonderful connection. And your students will frequently get so excited by the information they're learning about real people in real places that they will take off. And Meadow can talk a little bit about that also. The other thing I would strongly recommend is that you spend some time going through the resource that we mentioned from the Learning for Justice. There are podcasts that you can listen to that will help you understand. There's a whole rubric for what to teach and how to teach it. So once you get familiar with the information, you'll become more comfortable teaching it. My final comment is don't wait. If you wait till you're an expert, you will never do it. Do the work, start now, and learn as you go. That's my advice.
That's great, Linda. Amanda Atkinson-Lewis is asking if we have any thoughts on how to take into consideration that it would likely be white staff with little education on race, literacy, and with white fragility, being the ones teaching a very diverse group of students about this history. She says, I'm not saying that it should be a barrier that should keep students from learning this history, but would be curious what you all think about this dynamic and would love to hear your recommendations for how to prepare white teachers to responsibly teach this material. Seth, I saw you nodding your head. Did you want to take that?
Well, I'm happy to address the question, and maybe some of the other, maybe Linda wants to address it as well. But this is, I mean, it's called, the series is called Teaching Hard History for a reason. This is hard history, right? And for, I'm a white educator teaching this history. It's challenging. There's just no way around it. But one can't be afraid, to make mistakes. Too often what happens is that, individuals are afraid, white people, they're going to say the wrong thing, and so then they just don't teach it, and so it definitely involves a process of putting yourself out there, and you have to be willing to, to open to the possibility that you are going to make mistakes. But that's certainly preferable to not teaching this history at all.
Yeah, and to add to what Seth is saying, I am a white woman as well, and although I spent a great deal of time studying 20th century African studies, until 5 years ago, I was completely ignorant, entirely ignorant about New England's complicity in this history of exploitation and oppression and longstanding crimes against humanity. But so this has been a deep education for me. And it all begins with being curious, having the intention to learn, setting that intention and understanding that it's not a switch that we can flip. That it is a commitment to learning over the long term. And I think, as educators, another key is to be very clear about that with our students, to just, some call it making a positionality statement, just owning up to the fact that as a white person, I often say, I feel like I was born with a sort of congenital blindness, that it's like a condition that I need to try to heal from, but that there is so much, as a white person that my society was not asking me to see, was not forcing me to reckon with. And so it is really deep identity work, on the individual level to come to a place of understanding how deep this goes in our psyches. And once we have that sense, that is how we form this sustained commitment to learning. Yeah, I'll stop there. Anyone else want to?
I just want to add that although this is hard history to teach, that when a young BIPOC person gets this information and all of a sudden they feel a connection to a place that they maybe grew up in but never had heard any of this history before, it makes it all worth it. All of the, wondering about, am I going to make a mistake? How is this going to be accepted in the classroom? When you see that recognition from a young BIPOC person, that this sense of place, I think it makes it all worth it. And also that there are resources in this Teaching Hard History information that Linda was talking about, how to set up a classroom, how to have a comfortable environment to have these hard discussions. So it's not something that one has to do on their own.
Well, I know that we have reached 7 o'clock, and so run out of time. Heather Wood has a wonderful question here. What I would like to say is that we will take the unanswered questions. We will add them to last week's unanswered questions. and we will put that document in the resources folder. I have left a link to that folder in the chat, but I will also make sure that it is accessible from the Atlantic Black Box website. And finally, I just want to thank you all again for coming, for contributing to this conversation, and want to encourage you to connect with Atlantic Black Box. There's a big connect button. Leave your information, sign up for our newsletter so that we can stay in touch, because there's just so much critical information to share. So thank you, Nanette.
Thank you, everyone, so much. I just want to point out that we have a link to a post-event survey that we placed in the chat. We have had it there for a little bit, just pointing that out as well. Thank you all so very much for coming, and thank you for attending Parent University, and thank you all for this marvelous, marvelous presentation.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.